Welcome back to another episode of Gaining the Technology Leadership Edge. And today we're going to talk about some problems that occur when teams are faced with ambiguity. So today's going to be another solo episode. No guest today, just me. So I'm going to attempt to teach you a little bit about why ambiguity harms teams. So the first thing I want to tell you about is that teams don't collapse. They tend to drift. So you're not going to just see a team completely fall apart. But what you will see is that there'll be loss of momentum. Things will slow down. You're not going to hit your deadlines like you originally did. You're gonna find that your team struggles way more than they used to. So failure is rarely some dramatic like crash to the ground. But at the same time, you are in control of why the momentum slows down. Drift, it kind of looks a little bit like busy but frustrated. So have you ever seen a team that is working really hard, but it just feels like nothing's getting done, nothing's landing? That's a team that's faced with ambiguity from their leadership. And sometimes that ambiguity comes from all the way at the top, like the CEO and the rest of the management team. But a lot of the times, and most of the times, it comes from the leader of the technology department. Now, in some companies, that's the chief technology officer. In some of it, it's the vice president of engineering. And in some, it's the director of technology. It doesn't matter what the title of the leader is. What matters is that the leader is ambiguous. So when you have a team that's working really, really hard and nothing's landing, well, it makes them really upset and it brings down the morale. And when you bring down morale, you end up losing your employees later. Now, ambiguity survives, though, because it feels polite. People avoid being explicit to avoid tension or conflict. They don't want to create problems within the team. And here's the thing. Most of the time, at least at first, they don't realize that it's their leader causing the problem. And so they think that coming to you to complain about it or talk to you about it or bring it to your attention is going to mean one of their teammates or maybe even themselves gets in trouble. And that's just not true. So what can you do to fix that? Okay, well, one of the things is to be more clear. But the problem is that for some leaders, clarity, it feels confrontational. So when you name priorities and you name who owns those priorities, you force uncomfortable conversations. You have to talk to the leader who is in charge of priority number one. You have to talk to that owner about how they're going to accomplish that task. When is it due? How are they going to deliver it? And that can create some rather uncomfortable conversations. They might not have the answers. They might not know what you want. More ambiguity. So as the leader, it is your job to discuss that with them in a way that they understand. You have to be intentional about the descriptions that you give. Now, oftentimes leaders confuse intent with communication. They think it's clear because, hey, in their head, they know exactly what they want. How many times have you assigned a task that maybe you've done over and over and over again, and then you decide that you're going to delegate that task to somebody? And you delegate it to them. You kind of explain to them how it's supposed to get done. Maybe you even put it in writing for them in an SOP, which would be a great idea, by the way. And then they go through it, and then you go and you check back up on it, and you're like, wow, this wasn't done any way that I wanted it done. Not even close. Well, that is exactly what I'm talking about. You think you're being clear because you know in your head how to do it, but you're not really being clear. And it's important for you to communicate clearly. Then the next thing you have to do is you have to define success. Because if you don't name it, they're going to interpret it themselves. Everybody's going to fill in the blanks differently. They're not all thinking like you. They're not all understanding like you. They believe that they're doing what they're supposed to do and that success is whatever they say it is. But you have to define that for them. If success means hitting the launch date and having less than 50 bugs after it's launched, depending on how large the launch is, then that's what you define, and then you measure that after the release. you got to be careful, because if you leave things open to interpretation, well, then it creates divergence. Divergence means that the work's going to go in all different directions. The team's not working towards a common success point. They're working on what their interpretation of success is. And so by being more specific, you avoid the divergence, because divergence will quietly kill any momentum that a team has. Now, nothing's going to break, but nothing's going to compound either. So if I asked your team what matters most this week, what answer do you think I would get? Do you think I'd get just one answer? Or do you think that I'd get multiple answers? That's a really important distinction as well. So where does ambiguity hide? Well, first of all, there's ownership ambiguity. Deciding who's a contributor versus who's a decision authority, those aren't the same thing. You might have a team of 4 people. One of them's the leader. They get to make the decisions. The other 3, they're contributors. They help reach the point where decisions need to be made. But then the decision maker makes those decisions. Please don't make that you all the time. That's a really bad idea. Many people are able to help, but only one person should make the decision. If everyone owns it, well, then nobody owns it. If you give the ownership to everybody, you're diffusing the responsibility. You're spreading it out amongst the team. And a lot of people think that's a great idea. But again, momentum slows to a crawl, because they're pulling in every different direction. Think about a tug of war. If everybody pulls at the same time, even the weaker side can win. And that's what you want to do. You want to make sure that even if your team is a little bit weak, they're able to win by understanding who owns the task and who owns the decision-making authority. All right? Now, sometimes decisions get replaced with accountability, gets replaced with committees. And those decisions get deferred to groups of people, i.e. the committees, but that avoids ownership. And like I just said, you've got to have a specific owner for every problem or task or project that you have out there. What happens when you pass it off to a group is that now you get consensus theater. Meetings feel productive, but nothing ever gets decided. We used to do this thing where we would put these giant post-it board notes up on the wall. This was when I was working in an executive team. And we would talk about a problem. And they'd go around the room and they'd say, give me an idea for solving this problem. You'd throw it out there. Here's the key. Nobody censored that. They just wrote down whatever. You could be like, have Mickey Mouse come in and wave his magic wand. They'll write it down. Because later, they'd be like, okay, I think that my top 3 are number 1, number 5, and number 9. And then you put check marks next to it. Whichever one had the most check marks, that was the decision that made. I never loved that approach, because sometimes that wasn't the answer. It really wasn't. And we'd come back to it again later because that consensus was wrong. Now, high performers are going to hesitate when they think that there's invisible boundaries, because they're high performers. They follow the rules. They do what's asked of them, but they don't want to overstep their bounds. That's a really key thing. Others move forward hoping someone stops them. They take risks without any guardrails. And that's also extremely dangerous, because you wind up who knows where. And then there's the people who authority shifts to personality instead of role. The loudest person or the person who's the most senior, they just kind of win informally. People just acquiesce to whatever they say. Ownership only becomes clear after failure. So you go into postmortem and you say, all right, what happened here? Well, the postmortem reveals what should have been explicit up front. So have you ever waited because you weren't sure that you were allowed to decide? If you can, put it in the comments and let me know your answer. Now, The other thing is, what's a priority? What makes it to the forefront? I call it, when that's missing, I call it priority ambiguity. Everything seems to be important, right? Well, then there's no visible hierarchy. If like I'll give you an example of something simple. Should you start writing the code before you've planned out the project? Of course not. But if you haven't made the priority clear, then everything's important. Then there's no hierarchy. People are going to start wherever they feel the most comfortable. Now, a lot of times, just like with the previous case, with delegation rather, leaders assume that priorities are obvious. They forget that they're not sharing context evenly across their team. And this is key. It's why you have kickoff meetings for projects. So you can talk about what the priorities are, what needs to get done when. It's really, really important. Then there's the situations where teams create their own priority system. They sit there and they talk to each other and they kind of guess at what matters most. And you might as well throw a dart at a dartboard, right? It's about as effective. And then sometimes people will do what gets noticed. They do their work in a way that optimizes it for visibility, not what's strategic. That is super key to the entire situation. So you're creating more ambiguity, right? Then urgency beats importance. You get a fire, you got to put the fire out, right? And that's bad because you're not making progress. There's a time and place to put out fires, and there's a time and place to continue building. You as the leader have to define that, okay? Now, people hedge by doing just a little bit of everything. So now they're like, well, I don't know what to do, but I'm just going to dig into this a little bit, and I'm going to dig into that a little bit, and then I'm going to dig into that a little bit. But then you're not making any deep progress. There's nothing for you to look at and test. Everything is partially done instead of a section of the code being completely done. Then the other problem is that people have to context switch. That is a bad thing. You need to sit down and you need to know that I'm working on this and not have to worry about, well, am I supposed to also work on that and that? It creates a cognitive tax where people are left wondering, what am I supposed to do next? Then here's the bad part. That kind of ambiguity, it creates long hours and very little traction. Effort goes way up, but the outcomes don't. Because if everything matters, not a thing leads. If everything matters, nothing leads. So you have to jump on top of that. Then your standards are important. You need to let your team know what your standards are. What does done actually mean? What does it mean? If you haven't defined that, you're creating standards ambiguity. Now, different definitions coexist silently. Each team member is going to assume their own version of what the standards are. Some are going to say, oh, we always name our variables this way. We always indent our code this many spaces. Then someone else is going to say, no, that's wrong. This is what we do. And you're creating problems. Then, because outcomes aren't defined, how fast something gets done kind of becomes the proxy for success. And we all know that complete is best. So I can tell you a quick story. I used to work with this person, and man, every time he'd come to me and say, okay, I know you don't want to make decisions about these things. I know it's my job, but I want to ask you something. I'm going to ask to code this section of the project. How do you think I should approach it? And I would always say, in a way that works. It has to be efficient, has to function quickly, should not be any lag, just has to work. Okay. I would give them the outcome. It has to work, has to do this, it has to do the thing they ask for, it has to do it without errors, it has to do it quickly. They should not be sitting there waiting. I shouldn't hear complaints later about how slow the software is or any of that. When velocity becomes the proxy for success, it's because outcomes are not defined. So you, as the leader, are responsible for defining those outcomes, making it very clear every step of the way. And yeah, break it down into minute details. Break it down as finely as you possibly can. Then there's the point of what I talked about before, where it works correctly. If you'll notice, I pointed out that it works, it doesn't throw errors, and it is efficient? Well, I can tell you that when I worked for the restaurant delivery service as their CTO, I was tasked with completely rewriting their delivery service software. And I had a team that was offshore that was working on it. They were being paid a lot of money. I held back 20% of the allowed budget and split their work into 5 milestones. If they hit each milestone, they would get a bonus, which was 20% of what I had set aside. In this case, it was about $20,000. So they'd get an extra 20 grand. But what I told them is, if I get to the page and it's not doing exactly what it's supposed to do, but it displays and I can click the buttons and the buttons do what they're supposed to do, but maybe you did something wrong with the data or a calculation is off, that's fine. But if I get to the page and it blows up, or I click one of the buttons and it blows up, or I click a link and it doesn't take me where I'm supposed to go, that means they didn't test it. And that is low quality. And so I told them, if that happens, you forfeit the bonus. Well, this particular team was so good that they got 4 out of the 5 bonuses. Now, then the other thing that happens is rework gets normalized. You're not really hitting the mark, right? And because of that, you're going to have to redo what you didn't do correctly. Well, the we'll fix it later thing becomes part of your culture. Every situation, you're never actually done because you got to come back through another iteration of fixing the thing that you're working on, which is a terrible situation to be in. So make sure that you're not allowing that. Make sure that you're requiring that things be correct the first time. Then the other thing is that teams feel like whoever gave them the task is the one who's responsible for it. The downstream impact isn't owned by anyone. You have to make sure that doesn't happen. Somebody has to be the clear defined owner. And then finally, it's kind of related, it's related to the rework being normalized. Post-launch firefighting is expected. Stability is not the goal anymore. So there are going to be hundreds and hundreds of bugs. I'm going to tell you something. In that system where that team hit 4 of the 5 goals, because I was so clear with what their roles were and what success meant and what done was, they wrote close to, I think it was like 500,000 to close to 1 million lines of code. Post-launch, 48 bugs total. 48. That was it. I thought that was great because stability was the goal. So ask yourself, if you want to know if you have this problem, how many of you ship knowing it's going to come back later? How many of you do that? Put it in the comments if you do that. Tell us about it. Then, who are they supposed to escalate to? That's the key. When are they, so they face with a problem, right? What happens? When there's a problem, they can solve it or they can escalate it. And what happens is when you're not clear on escalation, teams that don't define it, they just escalate. It's up to you to define the goalposts for escalation. When should something be escalated and when should the team try to solve it themselves? That one is extremely important. Then there's the other one where people are afraid to bother you as the leader. They hold on to issues too long. I'm going to give you an example of that. So when I worked at the restaurant delivery service, I had a brand new developer. She spent a few weeks getting used to the code base, and then she was solving one of the problems. I told her when she sat down, hey, there's no such thing as a stupid question, especially because you're brand new, but it's kind of my motto anyway. And I'd say to her, look, I need you, if you run into a problem, please do not hesitate to come and talk to me. Now, I know that sounds like I'm contradicting what I said before, but at the time, it was me and her. We were the team. So it was at the very, very beginning of me growing that department. And so one day, I noticed that she had been sitting there for like 3-4 hours. And every time I'd come by, she was like scratching her head and she was researching. And so I asked her, everything going okay? She said, well, now that you ask, I didn't want to bother you, but here's the problem. You want to know something? in less than 5 seconds, I was able to tell her how to fix the problem. Because, I wrote the original software, so come bother me. And then sometimes people are afraid to make decisions because they're afraid of being blamed for the decision. So what do? They just escalate. They don't take the time to solve the problem. They just escalate right up the ladder. And then who's left making all the decisions? You. And that's terrible. You should never, ever, ever be in that situation. So you have to make them feel comfortable about what's the escalation ladder look like? What are the triggers for that? When do you stop trying to fix the problem and start asking somebody in leadership for help? But make it so that they don't feel like they're going to get, chastised for it. There's so many people that are in that situation. Then, leaders, they get surprised really late. The signals were there, but unclear rules block them from knowing the actual truth. Because again, not laying it out rung by rung, what's supposed to happen is going to create massive momentum issues. It's going to create chaos. And nobody wants chaos in a development project. The other thing is that trust erodes rather quietly because people don't know what's right anymore. They don't trust their own intuition. They don't trust their own gut. So let me ask you this. If escalation rules aren't clear, trust breaks, right? So what are you doing, or what are you going to do after this to make escalation rules more clear? Drop that in the comments. Now, let's talk about the human cost. What does ambiguity do to people? Have you given that any thought? Because, you're dealing with human beings here, and they're going to have certain feelings about things. There's a phrase that people use these days, and I hate it, but they're going to feel a certain type of way. Of course they're going to feel a certain type of way. Who cares? They have feelings about it. When you have unclear expectations, you create constant tension. Everybody's like, oh my God, I don't know what to do. Where do I go next? Is he going to yell at me if I make this decision? What's going to happen if I make this decision? It puts the nervous system into overload. It puts a lot of load on the nervous system. And that causes people to get sick. It causes them to stress out. And it causes them to quit their job. Then the other problem is there's no psychological closure here. People don't know if they're winning or losing. That's a huge, huge, huge issue because, again, you start getting into their head and they start being timid. Also, when you haven't defined where the finish line is, they never feel like they're done. They just keep right on working. And that's kind of a problem as well. And it causes higher performers to overcompensate. They work harder so that they can create certainty. Meanwhile, low performers hide. The ambiguity protects their mediocrity. You never find out that they're not doing a great job. You know why? Because there's no boundaries that they're operating within. So, like an example, you have a yard that has a gate. You have children. You tell them to stay in the backyard. How do you know if they're actually doing it? Well, if you're out in the front yard and they're out in the front yard, you know they did it. You know why? Because you told them to stay in the backyard. But by setting the boundary, you take that away. Then the next thing that happens with all this is they start to become physically exhausted. So then burnout begins. And it starts emotionally, not physically. But emotional burnout leads to physical burnout. And this is the thing that I try to teach people is to take a step back and see what's going on, observe your team from a distance, and avoid the burnout before it becomes a thing. Now, people then replace ownership with risk avoidance. They don't work like with confidence. They work defensively. Guard is up all the time. Remember, burnout begins with uncertainty, not workload. When things are unclear, people begin to burn out because they're just spinning their wheels and spinning their wheels and spinning their wheels. And that is not a helpful situation for your team to be in. Now, what leaders miss is some interesting things. First of all, stress doesn't show up in dashboards. Why? Well, metrics lag. That's the reality. You don't find things out. Like if you're tracking everything, you don't know what's true today because you only have up until maybe yesterday or day before the metrics. They lag. Then the other thing is that with your team being silent because they don't know what the hell to do, silence begins to look like alignment, but it's actually disengagement. And what will happen is your team will shut off. They'll kind of disengage themselves from the situation. Their feedback gets really vague. You get the everything's fine syndrome coming out. You ask them, how's everything going? Everything's great. It's like the people who always ask you, how are you doing? What do they expect? Fine, right? Try this one time when it's true. How's everything going? Oh, it's a rough day today. You're going to see a delay in response because they didn't expect that. They kind of disengage after they ask the question. Great people disengage quietly. They don't say anything. They don't complain. They don't make a lot of noise. But guess where it leads to? Yeah, they bail. Your best people bail on you. They don't like working like that. They don't like working in a situation like that. But to you, their exit feels super sudden. The causes were there for a long time and you just didn't see it. So who here has seen a great person leave with no clear explanation? Please drop that in the comments because that happens. Now, what's the operational cost of all this? Well, first off, rework. Different assumptions create parallel builds. If one part of your team is thinking that this over here is done, and the other part of your team is thinking this over here is done, they're misaligned, right? And when they're misaligned, somebody's going to make a mistake or they're going to go the wrong direction. So let's say these guys over here on this side go in the wrong direction. And these guys on this side, they go in the right direction. When you get to the finish line, what's going to happen to these people over here? Rework. You're going to have to do it over again. Also, what happens is sometimes you don't even notice this until it comes time to do integrations. And when you do the integration, you go, oh my gosh, there's conflicts here. And that's when the fixes become super expensive. But integrations are going to expose conflicts. Rework also drains morale because they feel like their original effort was wasted. And no team ever wants to think that their effort was wasted. That's just not a fun thing for them. Then teams, they stop celebrating wins because the launches just feel temporary. They're not going to be like, yeah, we made the deadline. Look at us. Because they know that later you're coming to them and you're going to be like, here's all the things you did that need to be fixed. Get back to work. Who wants that? I know I don't want that. And I don't like the look on people's faces when you tell them that kind of thing. Then there's decision latency, okay? People wait until meetings because they don't know who to ask. Authority isn't clear. Remember what I said. If you have 4 people and you put one as the leader, make sure those other 3 people know that that person is the leader. Make sure that they know that that's the person who decides when things escalate to you. When authority is clear, they make decisions sooner. When authority is not clear, well, they wait for meetings. Now, meetings always wait for the stakeholders. Everybody wants coverage. They want to have something to hide behind. Data becomes a shield. It's used to avoid judgment. Speed collapses invisibly because no one owns the slowdown. Yeah, things have crawled to a halt. Why have things crawled to a halt? Who's responsible for that? What caused that? Now, when you run into these things, don't be shy to go back and retool your approach. You never have to wait till tomorrow to retool the approach. You can retool the approach as soon as you discover that there's a disconnect. Then ambiguity slows decisions without ever touching the brakes. Does that make sense to you? So like for a car to slow down, you have to hit the brakes, right? But for a project to slow down, you just need to have ambiguity. Then you end up having meeting inflation. Meetings simulate clarity instead of creating it. You go into a meeting, blah, 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 everyone talks, everyone leaves there thinking they know what they're doing. But in reality, I've been in meetings where I used to work at this place where we'd have a meeting every Tuesday. And you'd go to the meeting and everyone would blah, blah, blah at each other. And you'd waste an entire hour, and it was a waste. And then you'd walk down the hallway back to your desk and you'd say, okay, so what are we supposed to do? And the person next to me would be like, I don't really know. So what got handled in that meeting? Literally nothing. Okay. Then people avoid making real, honest decisions. So you got your authority, right? And then the topics, they dance around the authority. They never go right to the authority and say, hey, what am I supposed to do? Because they don't want to make the decisions. They don't want to have those decisions made for them either. Follow-ups multiply because nothing ever gets resolved. You have this meeting, but you don't really know what you're doing. Like the guy, I don't know what to do. Well, now they got to go back and follow up. Okay? And then people start summarizing problems inside of Slack. Excuse me. Slack becomes a graveyard of summaries. There's no accountability trail. So how many meetings exist because no one can decide in your organization? Put that in the comments below, because that is a very common problem. So why is it that really smart teams never seem to fix this? Well, first of all, clarity feels risky. When you go defining something, God forbid, someone might disagree. Not sure why that's a problem for some people, but it is. And whether you think it's a problem or not doesn't really matter. What matters is if the people who are executing think it's a problem. Then sometimes trade-offs feel political. Saying no creates tension. Like, oh, you did that because you're above me in the team. And that's just not true either. Past clarity attempts caused friction. So when the leader tried to make clarity on things, people that disagreed were too loud. And so the leaders learned to avoid that. Don't. You're the leader for a reason. Act like it. Okay? High trust cultures avoid rules. They rely on goodwill. Everybody trusts everybody. So, hey, let's get this thing done. We don't need to define everything, right? Well, that's wrong. You have to define things. The other problem is this diffusion again. It enters in the picture. Everybody assumes that someone else will clarify for them. They don't want to do it themselves. And if the leader doesn't do it, well, they assume someone's going to do it for them. Ambiguity survives in teams like that because nobody wants to be the bad guy. That's where the decentralized A-team method that I created really helps to reduce ambiguity. So one of the main tenets of the decentralized A-team method is to have explicit decision rights. You name the decider publicly. That reduces the guesswork. You've said it, everyone hears it, make sure everyone hears it, and then they can move forward. Okay? Separate input from authority. Just because you're participating in a project doesn't mean you decide the direction, that you decide what done is, you decide what success is. Participation does not equal decision making. Then I want you to normalize, using DCAT, single point ownership. Clarity beats comfort every single time. Then you need to have a visible priority stack. I used to work with a guy and he used to say, first things first, second things never. What does that mean? Well, If you have a list of 10 things that need to get done and they're all in order of priority, 1 to 10, you don't work on number 1, number 3, and number 7, or you don't work on number 1 and then move to number 3 and then move to number 7. You always work on number 1. And when number 1 is done, number 2 becomes number 1, and you work on that. And number 3 becomes number 1, and you work on that. There's always first things first, second things never. You don't get to second things. You're always working on that one priority. Focus beats ambition. I know you want to get more things done, but focus is more important. State your trade-offs explicitly. Say what loses. Explain it. Be clear. Be detailed. Then constantly repeat the priorities. You have to assume that people forget. Because you know what? People forget. And by continually repeating the priorities, you're drilling it into their head. They have they can't do anything but understand what the priorities are. Then, before you even start, define what done is. Define success before work even starts. Why? Well, remember that rework we talked about? This eliminates rework. Because by defining success early, they know, did they complete it or did they not? Use observable outcomes, okay? Don't use vibes or feelings. Has to be observable. This is done when you can submit the form with validated data and no bad data gets through it. That's one way to define something. Then make sure that expectations are aligned up front, straight from the beginning. This reduces surprise for your team, which creates a lot less stress. Then you want really short feedback loops for your team. Weekly outcome signals will help you catch drift early. Because, think about this. If you're driving down the highway and, you're out one place, like one time I was driving through Utah and every single road said Ranch Road, next exit, Ranch Road, next exit, Ranch Road, next exit. And then exits were numbered. Well, assume you needed to get off at exit 35, but you got off at exit 25. And exit 35 takes you west. Well, exit 35 takes you east. Right? What happens when you get off the wrong exit? You go too far away. Then you have to turn back around and come back. You have to undo some of the things you did. And then to catch up with where you actually belong. So catch that drift early. Quick corrections beat perfect plans. You're learning rather than worrying about certainty. That's really, really important. Then feedback that you get, it kills the ambiguity because you're giving them reality and that replaces their assumptions. So by keeping the feedback loop short, you're able to jump in there and fix things that maybe are off course. So remember, short feedback loops are ambiguity repellent. So I have a challenge for you this week. I want you to pick one active initiative. Just one. And then in writing, I want you to answer. Who decides? Who's got the authority? What does success look like by Friday? What's the outcome? What are we not optimizing for? That's the trade-off. How will we know early on if we're wrong? That's the signal. If you can't answer those things quickly and easily, ambiguity exists. Clarity is not in control, and clarity is now kindness at scale. Teams don't need more effort. They need fewer unanswered questions. Repeat that with me. Teams don't need more effort. They need fewer unanswered questions. What's another word for unanswered questions? What did we start talking about? Ambiguity. Now, if this felt uncomfortably familiar for you, you're probably operating as a firefighter CTO. I built a short diagnostic to show you exactly where ambiguity is burning the your time and what to fix first. So I want you to go to gtle.show/firefighter quiz and take the firefighter CTO quiz. It's going to help you pinpoint where the ambiguity is that's burning your time. I want to thank you for watching this episode of Gaining the Technology Leadership Edge. And I want you to subscribe to the channel. It helps me out a great deal. And like the video. Just give me a thumbs up. And one last thing. If you want to know when more things come out from Gaining the Technology Leadership Edge, ring that bell notification because it will notify you each and every time something new comes out from this channel. Thanks so much for your time, and I'll see you again next Friday at 10 a.m. Pacific with another amazing episode of Gaining the Technology Leadership Edge. I'm Mike Mahoney, creator of the Decentralized A-Team Method. See you next week.